All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Weathering the 2025 Fraud Forecast, Bright Ideas for a Secure Year. So my name is Christine Champion, and I'm the head of marketing here at Authentic ID. If you're not familiar with us, we are a provider of identity verification and fraud prevention software. So I'm excited to welcome some of the leading voices in fraud prevention space today. So we have joining us as our co-host from Data Insights, Trace Fouché. He's a strategic advisor who's currently working on a 2025 fraud trends report and has a lot of great intel to share. So Trace is going to be kind of leading the panel discussion with some of our experts here. And then we have Blair Cohen, who's the founder and president of Authentic ID, and he brings decades of expertise to the identity industry. And chief strategist at Acuity Marketing Intelligence, and the founder of the Prism Project, the wonderful Maxine Moss. So welcome, everybody. So to kick things off, we'd love to hear from our attendees. So we're going to start with a quick poll to get a sense of what you're experiencing at your organization. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a button for a polling question. So you should see it or come up right now. And the question is, what fraud is on the rise at your organization? So take a moment to respond to that. You can do it's multiple choice. And I also wanted to note that if you do have questions throughout, you can click on the questions button and drop them in there. And then we'll spend time at the end of the webinar to go through those questions. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, Trace. I know one of the first topics that you wanted to cover is fraud trends. So it'll be interesting to see how your observations will compare to some of these polling results that are coming in.
Thanks, Christine. I was noticing Blair's orientation there. I was getting
sideways
with it.
Sideways and upside down.
You know, the old saying, AI is easy, but AV is hard.
Maybe he's a deep fake.
Yeah, there we go. It is a great pleasure to be here.
We have software for that.
It's a great pleasure to be here today. We've got a lot to discuss, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today. But yeah, I wanted to start off with a few highlights, we'll say, partly from what we've seen in 2024, but also a real brief look ahead into what we anticipate will likely be some trends to watch in 2025. So if you could go on to the next slide for me, Christine. We'll start with some research that we are currently, we're in the midst of pulling together right now. And it's based on data that we collected from a survey from our Financial Crime and Cybersecurity Forum, which we hold every year in Charlotte. This year was in August, and we surveyed 29 fraud executives, overwhelmingly from North America. So I have to caveat all this with saying this is the view from North America. However, we'll talk a little bit more about trends globally here shortly. But as you can see, we ask a series of questions every year. And a lot of them are the same, so we can gather up some year-over-year data and see how things are trending from one year to the next. One of the questions that we ask and have asked fairly consistently through the years are, when you think about your capacity to detect and prevent fraud attacks in your control frameworks, what's keeping you up at night? In other words, what are the things, what are the fraud types that you're most concerned about? And in 2024, as you can see, consumer scam attacks took the show. Now, this is something that this is 2 years running at least, where consumer scam attacks have been top of mind for fraud executives in terms of their capacity to detect and prevent these kinds of attacks in North America. And this is something that they share. I don't have a whole lot of empirical data here, but given the trend in fraud, specifically in consumer scam attacks, wouldn't at all be surprised to see that this same kind of data point were replicated in other markets as well. You'll also note there that number 2, first-party check fraud and deposit fraud resulting from application fraud. That was the number two thing that was keeping fraud executives in North America up. Now that is something that is exclusive to the North American market and the U.S. market in particular, owing largely to the overwhelming amount of check volume in circulation in the U.S. market that is peculiar to the U.S. market. But again, those consumer scam attacks are something that North American fraud executives share in common with a lot of their peers in global markets.
They should stay awake at night for that, Trace. It's going to increase in 2025. Just a prediction. Didn't mean to interrupt your flow, but it's going to go crazy.
You're absolutely right, and you beat me to the punch there. I definitely think this is something that we're going to see continue, both in terms of scam attacks as well as the check fraud. I mean, to cut right to the chase, I think the big driver behind this is while there are a lot of really solid solutions out there, control solutions for check fraud, the control solutions for consumer authorized push payment attacks is still maturing. We're still in the relatively early stages of seeing that market or that segment of the market, build up sort of we'll say a critical mass of maturity. And so couple that with the fact that obviously there in most markets outside of the UK, there are no, we'll say de jure liability, regulatory standards of care that would make liability, that would place liability on sending and receiving banks. You're still seeing a lot of fraud executives go about it from the perspective of our obligation is to make sure that the consumers are aware that there are risks here, but it's not yet, at least, to reimburse consumers for losses. Though I would point out that in markets, even in markets where, as is the case in the U.S. market, where we are very far removed from any potential shift in liability, we're still seeing a very high rate of policy shifts towards the reimbursements, voluntary reimbursement to scam victims, especially among the larger banks, where they're now, I think, more than when we did some consumer research, found a data point that I found really interesting. And that was that 51% of consumers who were polled and asked if they'd been reimbursed by their bank for consumer scams, 51% of those in the US said that they had been, to 46 or 47% of respondents in the UK, where they actually, this was prior to October 7th, but still, that it was higher in the US than in the UK, where they are much closer to a regulatory minimum standard of care. I think was very telling about the potency of a market standard of care that was merging in the U.S. market. But we'll come back to that one, because that is an endlessly interesting topic. But it is one of several, I think, market forces that is driving the trend in consumer scams. Another, obviously, is the adoption of faster payment systems. So this is based on research that we did this year that looked at trends in the US, in the UK, in India, in Brazil, as well as Argentina and Australia. And we found that in markets where central banks and federal authorities had a particularly strong drive towards adoption of faster payment services, namely in Brazil and in India, we saw a great deal more of aggressive growth in adoption of faster payments. And with it were correlated higher rates of growth in both ATO and authorized payment fraud. It's not to say that there weren't great rates of growth in other markets, such as in the UK and US and Australia, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But that the rates of increase are in fact correlated not only to the rate of adoption in faster payments, but also to the rate of adoption of consumer-oriented use cases among those systems. Christine, you can go on the next slide for me, please. So I mentioned that the rates of growth in other markets where the central banks weren't pushing the adoption of faster payments was particularly keen. I put this together several weeks ago that really tried to boil it down to a per capita number because it's interesting to me to see how various different markets are responding to the scam crisis. And I would point out, obviously, the two that I would point to that are sort of out there on the leading edge of addressing the scam crisis are the UK and Australia. In the UK, at least, I would say they're out there on the leading edge, largely because they've been suffering the longest. There has been a great deal of suffering on behalf of consumers in that market. And it's been going on at least going back to 2013, arguably older than that. In the UK, what's driving it is the severity of the suffering, where you can see that $586 per capita, that rate of loss is much higher than in any other market. And so again, you're seeing a high rate of mobilization in both those markets to address the scam crisis in a much more holistic manner, which I think is pretty interesting. One other note here, this is all based on estimates, and that's the data, the benchmarking in the UK is the gold standard. It is almost as good in Australia, though a lot of Australian bankers take issue with a lot of the data that's collected on this. They still agree that it is by and large better than nothing, certainly, and I would say a far cry better than what we see in the U.S. And Canada does a very decent job as well, though there is still some room for improvement there. That's all right, Christy. You can go on the next slide. So the last topic I wanted to turn to before we open it up for discussion is that, again, this is based on some of the research we did globally. What we wanted to do is not just look at trends in fraud, but also how fraud executives were adjusting their strategies and investment priorities to deal with the problem. There are two big takeaways here. The first is that globally, the global trend seems to be fairly decidedly in the direction of orchestration and automation. And what that was, I would add to that consolidation. There's been quite a lot of mobilization to consolidate, not only within the transaction monitoring segment of the control framework, but also on what I would call the signal detection side of the control framework. And this is primarily to counter the increases in ATO and authorized payment fraud, but also to help clamp down on expenses and to help find efficiencies, as well as ways to improve accuracy and reduce, have a little bit of a lighter touch on legitimate customers. The other trend, and if you go on to the next slide for me, please, Christine, is at least so far as our data is concerned, specific to North America, though I would be interested to see how this applies to markets globally. What we've seen in the North American market is something of a reversion back to application fraud controls and authentication controls. Now, I say a reversion because over the last couple of years, we have seen a shift. As long as we've been tracking investment priorities, authentication and application fraud controls have always been in the number 1 and number 2 spots, with the exception of the last couple of years when they were at least briefly dethroned by check fraud. Well, not check fraud solutions, but actually in 1 year, it was mule detection controls. And in others, it was, I think it was around real-time payment fraud controls. long story short, what we're seeing, at least in 2024, is that these investment priorities are shifting back in the direction of application fraud controls as well as authentication. Now, I think this is interesting for a number of reasons, and we're gonna use that as sort of a pivot point to talk about some trends that are occurring more broadly. One of the things that I would point out, and this will lead me to my first question for the panel here, is that you can't go to a webinar or a forum and not hear someone talk about AI and the impact that generative AI and deep fakes and things of that nature are having on fraud trends. And from our perspective, what we see is, for the most part, when we ask fraud executives, are you seeing evidence of attacks by deep fakes, by that look like they're fairly, that they originated from some method of generative AI? Interestingly, a lot of fraud executives will point out, well, if we do, it's the result, it's sort of the exhaust from some other attack that's further upstream in the kill chain. Meaning that a lot of these attacks are being perpetrated directly on consumers in order to expose their credentials and or to expose sensitive information that's used by fraudsters, perhaps other than those who are making the attacks, to initiate account takeover and or authorized payment fraud attacks. Now, all that being said, I'm curious to see what thoughts my panelists, Blair and Maxine, have on that topic. So Blair, perhaps we'll start with you.
I got a little bit lost in the question here,
yeah.
but in terms of generative AI and deepfakes, I was looking back at the poll questions that we posed at the beginning of this webinar, and a lot of the respondents aren't really reporting this. So we've got 13% of synthetic identities, only 10% are seeing deepfake and generative AI. And I wonder if these companies have the proper tools in place to really understand that they're under attack and how much larger of a problem that this really is, because the deepfake issue is something that consumers are super vulnerable to. This stuff has gotten so good. We've been seeing deep fakes and generative AI being used to attack our enterprises now for many years. In the past, when they used a Gen AI tool to phish you, for example, you could see some pretty obvious things as a consumer. Misspellings, bad grammar, bad placement, maybe a fuzzy logo, things like that. We're not seeing that today in these phishing attacks. It's perfect grammar. It looks exactly like Bank of America's logo. So they've become so much more sophisticated. I personally, I'm an expert at this, and I couldn't tell you the difference between a synthetic face and a real person if it were displayed to me on a computer screen right now. I just can't do it. It takes super sophisticated tools, but it can be stopped. There's some pretty alarming statistics on this slide. So it cost $1.33 on average to create a deepfake AI. Are you kidding me? $1.33. I mean, the barrier to entry here is super low, A. And B, the tools have gotten so simple, so easy. It used to be that you needed to have a fair amount of sophistication to generate a deep fake. Today, you chat to these tools in plain English, and it'll come out in whatever language you want, and everything looks considerably better than it did. But the cost of these things so far is estimated at $1 trillion. I think that's an underestimate. I'm guessing that it's quite a bit higher than that. And to just emphasize my point that I said earlier, when surveyed, 91% of people said they couldn't detect a fake person if we showed them 6 different people. Couldn't detect a deep fake from the real person on the screen. I'm a victim. I fail it every time. But some other interesting statistics here. Where are they being used? Certainly a lot of proof that they were used for the elections. We've uncovered a number of different dubious videos and transcripts and photos that were obviously deep fakes. Um, but what are they doing? Are they targeting big enterprises or are they going after consumers? And right now, I think you're right, Trace. What we're seeing is they're going directly after the consumer and looking for the romance scams and those kind of things.
Well, and that gets so destabilizing. And there's a lot of stuff to riff on there, Blair. But I'm gonna hone in on the concept of fraud as a service because, regardless of whether they're targeting the financial institution or the financial institution's customers, the fact that they're able to do it now on an industrialized scale and in a way, I mean, we used to always kind of semi-jokingly say if the fraudsters ever discover spell checker, we're in for trouble. And not only have they discovered spell check, but they're now optimizing for the language for deceitfulness and effectiveness, which is troubling. So again, I guess my question is, where do we see things evolving? Obviously, with the whole fraud as a service, things are moving in the direction of industrialization. But Maxine, maybe I could get you to weigh in on some ideas on where you see this going.
Well, the bottom line is, as Blair mentioned, and when you talk about fraud as a service, essentially Gen AI are now the tools of the fraudsters. For a long time, Gen AI were the tools of people fighting the fraudsters, and that has just disappeared. And I've always characterized sort of the identity game as an arms race, and this is just typical. And so now we've got, is our Gen AI better than your Gen AI? And as Blair mentioned, again, human beings are human beings not very good at identifying deep fakes. Human beings are not terribly good at identifying people. We've known for 20 years, even when facial recognition algorithms were pretty bad 20 years ago, when they were hitting 70 and 80% match rates, they still were far superior than average human beings. So we just need to get over this idea on every level that asking humans to verify identity in the world we live in is just a bad idea. And so then the question is, what's the state of the tools and how are they going to evolve? And the reality is, they're never going to be 100%. There's no, I have this conversation a lot with people and they're like, well, we can't use biometrics because it's not 100%. I'm like, nothing in life is 100%. A password match is 100%, but it doesn't tell you anything about who's behind it. So some of this is sort of, I think, kind of rejigging the way we think about fighting fraud. It is, again, it is not a, there's no final achievement. It's an ongoing battle, and it's never going to be 100%. And so I think if we kind of let go of some of those notions, then we can start thinking about, okay, how do we practically apply the high quality technology solutions that are on the market today to addressing these problems, understanding that 100% identification of fraud is not the objective, right? And so we have to look at measurements in terms of attack volumes and reduction of fraud. And Blair is going sideways and upside down again, so a little bit distracting. Anyway, so I think part of it is that it's what's the frame, and one of the things that's come up in the research that my company has done, and we are not exclusively focused on financial services. We are looking at the world through the lens of biometric-centric digital identity. And Christina, if you have that slide, you can pull it up. Like, one of the things that's really interesting to me is sort of the perception of, is the slide going to come up? There we go. The perception that people that are applying this technology have from the enterprises that are trying to put this stuff into effect. And so one of the things that's super interesting to me is they're thinking about it from the in terms of benefits and how confident they are that the technology can solve the problem from the perspective of operational efficiency and fraud and automation, right? They're thinking about this, okay, this is a technology solution that we're applying. And what's really interesting to me is that there's not as much confidence or motivation based on customer experience. And what we know from the biometric-centric digital identity space is that people have long said, well, you can have a good customer experience or you can prevent fraud, right? And enable automation. And that is actually not true. And with solutions like, Authentic ID, basically you get both. And our experience and our understanding is that the companies that are approaching this from the customer experience perspective, applying these really high quality AI-based technologies. And I kind of laugh that everyone's talking about Gen AI in the last 2 years like it's something new, because the biometrics world has been using artificial intelligence to train algorithms for years. But when you think about it through the lens of the customer experience, and as we're talking about this is like, there's this whole pushback on customers, and people are moving towards the customers because they're an easier target when they're trying to engage in fraud. If you think about it from the experience of the customer applying these technologies, the automation, the operational efficiency, the fraud reduction you get automatically with these technologies. So in my mind, it's like, how do we create a much more positive customer experience that actually is much more secure for the customers that we're worried about and who are, in fact, sort of the soft targets in this whole scenario that we're looking at?
Yeah, there's some great thoughts there, and again, I'm reminded also of what comes to mind for me there is that fraud is, at the end of the day, it is a business problem. We tend to think about it as, of course, it is a risk management problem, but ultimately it is about protecting what consumers, protecting the institution's consumers. And protecting that trust relationship.
Yeah.
And that oftentimes, I think what's fascinating to me about the trends that I reviewed earlier, in at least in terms of scams, and to a lesser extent with the check fraud in North America, but certainly with ATO, is that now that the fraudsters are sort of drawn towards attacking consumers directly, as they seem to be so fond of doing now, it represents a relatively unique challenge, at least in terms of managing risks to those customers. At least insofar as, again, outside of the UK, there are no regulatory standards of care that are imposed. And so we're seeing market standards of care emerge that are pressuring financial institutions to kick in policies for reimbursements and controls that are more effective at protecting those customers.
It always honestly seems insane to me. I mean, some cases it's clearly the consumers being scammed, but there are an awful lot of cases of quote identity theft where, to me, it's not the consumer who's being attacked and is the victim. It's the financial institution that has decided that this person they're dealing with is the actual correct person when it's not. And to me, that's not the consumer's fault. That's the institution's fault. So I definitely would like to see more pressure. I'm glad we're seeing market-based pressure, but I'd like to see more regulatory pressure, because so many of these cases of identity theft, the victim is not the consumer. The victim is the bank.
Well, yeah, ultimately, that's what's under threat, and I think that's what makes this crisis such a unique one. The other thing, and where I was driving at, was that identity is always in the picture, but it's coming back into the picture in a way that I think is pretty interesting, and that's where I kind of want to pivot to where we're going to see things happening in 2025, because you'll remember that the investment priorities that I showed there, at least in North America, were shifting back in the direction of application fraud controls. I think this is a pretty interesting trend, because again, I think there are more institutions out there, more financial institutions that are seeing the role that identity is playing, even in scams, in protecting their customers against scams, namely in terms of acknowledging, which I think is a fairly exciting development, that that mule activity and detecting and preventing mule activity on the receiving side of payments is now becoming much more of a priority. And how better to detect mules in your portfolio than with beefing up some controls at the front door. So now, given all that, I guess my question for you guys is where do you see, and Blair, we'll start with you, where do you see things sort of shifting in 2025 with regard to investment priorities and where things are going?
I'll start with where you just left off a little bit with mule fraud. Mule fraud is a really hard problem to solve. I mean, you've got a real genuine person walking into an establishment with a real ID. I mean, how do you deny that transaction? You can't on the first time around. But we've implemented tools that recognize unusual velocity. So it's unusual for a person to go from Bank of America to Capital One to US Bank to somebody else all within 3 hours. That doesn't make sense. That's not normal human behavior. So if we're able to hash and tag and recognize these repeat attacks that are happening in unusual velocity, it can have a remarkable effect on stopping things like mule fraud, which in the past people have just held up their hands and said, we can't stop it. I mean, there's just nothing that can be done about this. I do think that companies are going to have to start investing very, very heavily in protecting their digital channels, though, to prevent deepfake and Gen AI attacks. It's just too easy these days to happen at scale. I mean, there's a website out there called Fake Name Generator. I don't want to start advertising for these criminals, but when you go there, I mean, literally it'll create a name and an address and an email address and geo coordinates and everything that you can imagine that you would need to come up with a unique identity. All the data is there. Then you go to another website and create an identity document that has all of that data on it and upload either your photo or a synthetic photo of somebody that never existed.
Blair, you're giving a how-to. A how-to.
Well, it's out there, Maxine. I mean, it's public information. There's 2,000 different websites out there to create these fake IDs and to create these Gen AI attacks. So they're out there. And your people, so many of these banks, so many of these telcos, so many of these companies have back end fraud organizations with 800 or 1,000 people in it that are manually looking at these transactions as they came in, and they're defenseless. They just absolutely can't detect this thing with the human eye. You've got to implement strong liveness detection controls, but I absolutely think that the use of biometrics needs to increase. It's the only way to prove who's behind the transaction. Successfully being able to enter usernames and passwords doesn't prove anything. It tells you somebody knew the username and a password, but it doesn't tell you anything about the identity behind that transaction. Biometrics solved this, and they solved this in a very user-friendly way, which Maxine noted earlier. That's down real low on everybody's list. I don't understand that because it's the perfect balance between fraud detection and customer experience. Super simple, super easy. Think about things like first party fraud. You know, when a real user comes in and frauds you, and they call you up at the end of the month and say, wait a minute, that wasn't me. I didn't do that. How does an entity know? I mean, somebody successfully logged in the username and the password and made that transaction, but they can't definitively know the identity behind that. So most of that first party fraud gets written off, completely written off. And that amounts to roughly 30% of all fraud out there. With biometrics, that problem goes away. I mean, I've got your date and timestamp. I've got your face. I've got liveness detection. I've got geo coordinates. It makes it really, really hard for you to call up and say, I didn't do it at the end of the month when you've got such concrete proof that they did.
You know, it's interesting because there was someone reporting a scam yesterday, and apparently someone had cloned an individual's phone, and the bank said, "Oh yes, you authorize this because we sent you an SMS." Like the idea that an SMS to someone's to a quote device, it verifies identity is so insane. And honestly, I think so. Talking about what kind of riffing on what Blair said, what I think about going forward in terms of next year and beyond is a couple of things. One is this concept of decentralized identity and on-device identity is going to solve all our problems. I think next year, I'm hoping maybe that becomes the year that idea dies, right? I mean, I've always believed, and I think it's becoming even more clear, is that you have to have some combination of centralized and decentralized. And yes, it's really great to push as much decentralization as we can, especially for low risk and low value transactions. But I think we're going to start to as an industry, and I'm hoping in the end user community, we're going to start to think about what are the actual transactions that are happening and what is the appropriate level of identity verification that's connected to those. My company, QD Market Intelligence, published a report recently, and we put out this model, what we call the hierarchy of identity, which starts at the foundational human identity, where you link a human, preferably in real time, to their biometric data. And that goes all the way through a series of types of, identity, like pseudonymous identity, which is like, I just need to verify my age so I can have access to something, versus transactional identity. Like, I was just in Boston and I was using my phone to pay for the T there, which is their metro system. Right. So I think part of this is we have to, as an industry, we got to start thinking about sort of what kind of identity we're talking about and what kind of tools are appropriate, and in the case of financial transactions, especially high value financial transactions, phone-based identity and SMS and all this stuff, it just isn't adequate. And I'm hoping we're going to start to see some awareness growing within these key industries, especially financial services, that they have to really take a different route. And the other thing too is this notion of so sort of getting rid of this duality of centralized versus decentralized. And then the other thing, along the lines of Blair's comments, is to really understand that customer experience and fraud prevention are not two different things. They are the same thing. They're two sides of the same problem. And implementing these fraud prevention technologies, especially if it's done through the lens of what is my customer experience, will not only affect the bottom line in terms of fraud reduction, it will increase your
Trust.
Trust and
Credibility.
and credibility. And customers are like, oh my God, this is so easy, so I want to do this. Right. And so instead of fraud being like, oh God, like, oh, fraud prevention, and then I have to make 6 phone calls, and, they don't like whatever data I put in, or I forgot my password, or like that stuff goes away, and we make people's lives easier. And if we can make any contribution to literally reducing the number of SMS messages that are sent out in the world, I would consider that to be a major metric by which we judge the success of our industry.
Well, Maxine, you a little while ago, you brought up that you'd like to see more in the way of regulation. So tell me a little bit more about what kinds of changes do you anticipate we'll see in 2025 with regard to regulation? And I know this varies market to market, but be interested in your take. And then maybe also, if you could share with us a little bit of, what role does that play, at least in terms of spurning mobilization, we'll say, in the industry.
Well, I mean, I am not an expert in regulation, so I don't necessarily want to weigh in terms of what I think is going to happen. But what I hope will happen, and I think there's a number of, I think part of what we're seeing right now is sort of what I call the infrastructure of an industry start to evolve. Industry associations, testing, certifications, and part of that too is regulation. But is to start having like a more reasonable and fact-based discussion about this class of technologies, rather than people getting hysterical and saying, oh my God, we can't use biometrics at airports. I mean, like, that is insane. Biometrics at airports is one of the best things that's ever happened since 9/11 to make our lives easier. And so, part of it is, I think, as an industry kind of growing up and having the infrastructure so we can actually start addressing these issues. Regulation comes from legislation. And so you have to start educating legislators and policymakers and their staffs to really understand what we're talking about. And I would like to see some of our industry move in that direction around some of the existing organizations and associations that, can help facilitate those kind of conversations, because, the lobbying and the engagement that's been done has very much been on a company by company basis for specific companies trying to move the needle in their direction. And given the kind of pushback we're seeing, and especially around the TSA's use of biometrics, I think we really need to as an industry to kind of do more collaborative work. And that's something that my company's been involved with. We've put out a series of reports. We have this thing called the PRISM Project, which is trying to basically create some of that collaboration and forward moving momentum so that we can start speaking. Yes, we have individual companies and they all have different technology and algorithms and proprietary technology solutions that are fantastic, right? We also have to, as an industry, grow up a little bit and say, okay, we have to collaborate to move the industry forward and create a larger pie and to educate people that are going to start making those decisions about what should and shouldn't be done, what can be used. And something I've always believed in, which is to build safeguards into the technology so that it can't be misused. So, I mean, that's more of a vision and a wish than necessarily a prediction, but that's
the fraud as a service people will tear that right apart.
Yeah, they have a tendency to go off and create their own standards, don't they?
Yeah. For sure.
So that's
what I would love to see along the legislative front, just to add on a little bit of that. Yep. I 100% agree that we need to educate the legislators. They're out there providing a lot of misinformation. There should have been by now a federal privacy law passed. Instead, we've got this myriad. We have 20 different states that are looking at this in a very different way, a very different approach. And it just complicates the heck out of things for companies like us, for our customers, for everybody else. I mean, and then as you mentioned earlier, Trace, for those states that have zero regulations surrounding the use of biometrics, for example, they prohibit it altogether. What's going to happen there? My gracious, if I were Baltimore or Portland or maybe a resident of the state of Illinois right now, I'd be talking to my legislator and trying to get them to change.
Yeah. Well, it's that is a recurring theme that I've certainly observed quite a lot, and it maybe in an accelerating manner, is around information sharing, right? And obviously the primary headwind to information sharing is the data privacy constraints. And so I see that as a great opportunity for better collaboration, especially between the industry, and not just between the industry and legislators and regulators, but in the industry and other industries, for example, in telecommunications and social media and other kind of tech platforms, where there are so many great opportunities and badly needed opportunities to capitalize on better collaboration, and largely in and around information sharing. So, in fact, we had a question from Rajesh earlier about consortium and data sharing helping in reducing mule accounts. And certainly I think there's a lot to that, right? So, what do you all see as it relates to the sort of, are we going to see more in the way of information sharing? Are we going to see it more targeted and more directed around certain identity related concepts like mule detection? Or do you guys see any of that changing in 2025? And Maxine, maybe we'll start with you, and then Blair, I'd like to hear your comments as well.
I think that's a heavy lift, particularly in financial services. and other regulated industries. Though, interestingly, one of the models for this really could be, and I know it's a completely different industry, though it is a regulated one, is what the casinos do, right? Casinos always share information about fraudsters and, people that, whether they're, committing crimes or whether they shouldn't be in the casinos because they have gambling problems, whatever. This goes back almost like 20 years in the industry. At the time, they were faxing pictures from one casino to another, and they have implemented facial recognition and been using it, in targeted ways, to identify people who are threats. And that, they share that information, and it is hugely valuable to the casinos, and it creates, just a better environment because you don't have organized crime, basically infiltrating in a way that just creates an bad situation for the people that are legitimately there to gamble and enjoy their experience. So I mean, it can be done there. And the other thing too is there's a whole class of privacy enhancing technologies that are available in the marketplace, so that this fear that people have that, oh, my facial image is being stored and shared, it's not really happening, right? We're storing and sharing template data, and template data are encrypted, algorithmically, mathematically derived representations. So if somebody saw what that was, they're like, okay, well, that's not really me. That's just some bunch of numbers, right? And so we're getting better and better at disassociating that data and being able to match and manipulate that data without having it really related to what a person would consider their own image. And I think those kind of things are hugely helpful. And I think, there is a whole class of those technologies coming out. And I think that's going to really, again, it's about communication. Like, it's about the industry letting the industries know, letting the legislators know, letting the consumers know, right? We're still answering the same kind of questions about biometrics that we were answering 20 years ago. So we still have a lot of work to do. And it really comes down to not just technology and not just having integrity in the process, and not just, setting up systems to validate and certify that technologies meet in certain standards. Like I always say, you wouldn't plug your lamp into a wall without knowing that it had been tested on, probably 17 different metrics to make sure it wasn't going to explode. And I think we're still in a place with our technology that we're not there yet. So there's a lot of work to do. And I think that's work we need to do in the industry. And so, we're not going to solve all these problems. Like 2025 isn't going to be like, oh yes, everything's going to be great. The world's going to, around biometric identity is all going to be fantastic. But I think we are going to make progress. I think we're getting to a level where a lot of the companies that are playing are becoming more mature companies, and that helps push the maturity of the industry. So we have to take responsibility as an industry for some of this. And we just have to hope that we can see, meaningful progress, not just on the technology front, not just on the accuracy and speeds front, not just on the customer experience front, but on what I call the infrastructure component of evolving the industry.
Blair, thoughts? I know we wanted to keep a little bit of time for Q&A, so those who are...
we do. So I'll try to be brief on this, and I'm going to kind of expand a little bit on what Maxine just said. The casino example is a perfect example. The gloves were off for these guys. They could do whatever they wanted. Law enforcement was behind them. They enforced this. Law enforcement in Las Vegas didn't want the criminals in there. So the gloves were off for them. The gloves are on for all of the financial institutions and for all the FIs. There's been so much alarm and negative reporting around how this stuff is used. I absolutely agree that collaboration is 100% the right way to go. I mean, we see this, we service most of the telcos. And these fraudsters, they don't care about ripping off AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile or Charter. All they want is that phone. And they're going to go from one to another, to another, to another, to another. We see it in mule fraud, where a gang will go recruit a bunch of kids from a college. They'll go out and commit credit suicide for the day, but they'll procure 12, 15 phones by going from store to store to store. Collaboration would stop that. This concept that I just talked about velocity, the way that we're able to obfuscate and hash these identities and be able to share a hashed identity, which, as Maxine alluded to earlier, that's a privacy preserving technology. I'm not sharing your face. And by the way that we store faces today, in a lot of cases, for most of the privacy preserving technologies, it's no longer even a template. So we're not taking a picture of your face and creating landmarks and creating a template. We take your face, turn it into a math blob that can't be reverse engineered. It's literally nothing. So you could open up your database to a fraudster, let them have all those math blobs they want. There's literally nothing that they can do with that. It's gone to the point where there's been a ruling that say that some of these privacy enhancing technologies take that, what we all think of as a biometric, and consider it no longer a biometric because it doesn't store any facial characteristics. It's just a glob of math. And once you've got just a glob of math, the privacy lawyers' concerns about sharing data from one company to another get reduced. They're still there. I'm not saying they're going away. I'm not saying 2025 is going to be the year that that's going to explode, but it holds promise for sharing data.
And I also think it's important, just, building on that, is to, again, going back to this concept of the hierarchy of identity, for these organizations to understand that you don't need to use the full biometric verification for every single thing you're doing, right? It's
risk-based.
Like, they're sort of like, we're going to use it or we're not going to use it. It's like, no, you have to, take a system solutions approach and understand where those vulnerable points are, right? And not get hung up on just phone verification if it's something, like silly, or, whether I'm getting on the metro, I'm buying, a soda from a soda machine, whatever it is, right? Like, that's
important. No risk. Yeah.
People need to really kind of understand that. And I think the risk assessment people in these financial institutions tend to understand it. And so I think there's a business community that's beginning to understand it. And then there's sort of, I think, IT and cybersecurity folks who get very hung up on a lot of this stuff. And again, a lot of it is education. It really is. And it seems like, Blair and I have been around for a while. We've been talking about this for years and years, and we shouldn't have to anymore. But the truth is, it's a much wider marketplace. So we have to keep being willing to be out there and having these conversations.
A lot of conversations to be had for sure. All right. So we do want to open it up for questions. Christine, I don't know if we've got any queued up.
Yeah, it looks like we have another one that came through. It's quantum computing, when combined with AI, poses a significant threat to the integrity of authentication systems across all levels. What strategies or plans are being developed to mitigate this emerging risk? So, with quantum computing, it'll be easier and faster to break encryption keys, and it will also improve biometric spoofing. So what do you guys recommend there?
There's a whole class of quantum resistant
encryption technologies out there.
Yeah, it's starting, and it's really important. It's non-trivial. It's true. It's going to turn things upside down, and I think we're starting to see the tools that are going to help address those problems.
And I think we're seeing the tools before this really becomes a reality. Quantum isn't yet a reality. So the fact that people are getting behind this and creating solutions before it becomes a reality is quite encouraging. But we all know that that's a real threat, and that could happen and will happen at some point.
I was going to say it's more than just encouraging, very comforting, because, if had countermeasures not started to get underway in terms of development, then it could be an exceptionally disruptive force.
Honestly, if you think about it just from an entrepreneurial opportunity perspective, I spent years in Silicon Valley, and I very much have lived in that entrepreneurial space. There are so many people chomping at the bit because everybody understands this thing's coming. And so I have faith generally in that sort of tech entrepreneur mindset, that there are, 20, 30, 50 people out there, small companies, starting to think about how to do this. And, mucking around with it. And I think we'll see, that's something I think we're going to see in 2025. I think we're going to see the emergence of companies that are actually have commercial products for quantum resistant cryptography.
Yep.
But even then, the storage, these privacy preserving technologies, if we're storing something that's worthless, there isn't much motivation for them to try to break your quantum encryption.
Right.
So
yeah, you can have my biometric data blobs,
take it.
I've had it.
I think that's the only question that we saw that came through. But do you guys have any other additional words of parting advice for the attendees? Any predictions for going into the new year?
Trace, you go first.
Well, I in terms of predictions, I agree with both Blair and Maxine that 2025 we won't see any solutions. I think we'll begin to see a lot of mobilization begin to take form and to start firming up in terms of the contours and the shapes that mobilization is taking. Exactly what that will be is hard to say. But I think, kind of to Maxine and Blair's point, there are a lot of really strong market incentives out there to begin to capitalize on the opportunities that exist in the market for better collaboration, better solutions in the marketplace. And so I'm looking forward to what I think is going to be a pretty exciting year.
Yeah, I really think a lot of it, from my perspective, is we're just going to, this market is maturing, and we're just going to see the evolution of the infrastructure, and that to me is critical, because we can't, so that's, I think the idea, when we think about biometric centric digital identity, there are certain requirements around privacy, around certifications and reliability and trust. And I think those things, I think, are going to definitely move forward, because we're seeing more of a commitment, I think, from the vendors in the industry to engage in that way. So that's one thing I think is definitely going to happen next year. I think, I think we'll see more consolidation. We've seen some significant consolidation in the past couple of years. I think that trend is going to continue. And I think we're going to see more and more of the big sort of IAM and SIAM players coming around to understanding that the biometric technologies and capabilities are not just things they have to hang on the outside of their solutions, but they're critical core components of their technology going forward.
And I hope you're right. And I hope you're right about the collaboration part.
I'm doing the best I can.
Wonderful.
To make it happen.
So I think with all of the buzz around generative AI, and I think there's some really strong liveness detection capabilities out there today that are deployed that'll detect the vast majority of that, but there are workarounds. So I honestly think that 2025 is going to be the year of multimodal biometrics. So instead of just having you show your face to authenticate yourself, we're going to combine your face biometric with your voice biometric, all of this with liveness, and probably there will be a dynamic passphrase that's going to pass across your screen that you're going to have to utter. It's going to change for every person. So there'll be lip reading involved as well. Those three combined, I'm not saying it's going to be impossible, but it would be exceedingly difficult to beat a multimodal biometric authentication solution.
It's interesting too, because there's a number of companies out there now that are working that have, that are working on and have touchless finger and hand palm capabilities too. And so I think, that's one way, again, to make it tougher for the fraudsters. But again, it's an arms race. Like we're gonna be constantly, evolving in how we respond. So, but I totally agree with Blair. I think we have to be more sophisticated in terms of how we think about it. In the old days in biometrics, when I first got in the market, it was the fingerprint people and the face people and the iris people all fighting each other about who had the best biometric. And I think we're long past that. But now I think, it's, and sort of face has really had its time for the past several years. But I think I agree with you that, because there's more attacks, we have to get more sophisticated and we have to use whatever tools we have.
Again, the thought of fingerprint and palm are interesting too, because things like my voice,
Yeah.
I do webinars and that kind of thing all the time. My voice is out there, could be recorded, could be replayed. Same thing with my face. Very few people know what my palm
Going like
looks
this, yeah.
or my fingers look like.
Well,
So
and similarly with geospatial and maybe even device ecosystems, right?
Yep.
All within close proximity. That you add all that stuff together, and it becomes exceptionally difficult to spoof.
Yeah. And people get freaked out because then they're like, oh my God, they're spying on me. So then again, we need this understanding, and we need to build in safeguards into the technology so that that stuff can't be misused.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Trace, Maxine, and Blair for this insightful discussion. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar after the call with some additional resources to help you navigate the year ahead. And if you guys have any questions that come to mind after the webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. So thanks again, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thanks,
Okay.
I'm going
everybody.
to finish sideways.
We did get a question, Blair, if you're doing yoga. I forgot to mention that one. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.